Okay, Emma, floor is yours.
Yep. Just giving everyone 1 minute to come into the room. Thank you so much for joining us all today. And thank you so much to the Syrian Network for Human Rights for hosting this event with some outstanding speakers and organizations. I'm your moderator, Emma Beals. I'm honored as always to be with you today. And as always, I hope that this will be the last such occasion we have to have such a meeting, because we're almost 10 years out from the start of Syria's popular uprising, and that is too long. For each of those 10 years, the Syrian Network for Human Rights has documented multiple patterns of egregious human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, arrests, torture, displacement and forced displacement, the use of prohibited munitions and other highly destructive weapons, and all sorts of other violations. The Syrian regime is by far the most prolific perpetrator of these violations in terms of both the severity and the quantity of these crimes, and some of them constitute crimes against humanity and war crimes. For 10 years, the international community and the Security Council have failed to mitigate the severity of these violations or to help end the Syrian conflict. Meanwhile, the demand of the popular uprising remains the same: to hold all perpetrators accountable, to move Syria from dictatorship towards democracy, and to ensure an adherence to human rights principles and to international law. I want to take a minute to recognize Fadel's team. Many of the Syrian Network for Human Rights staff have been with the organization for 10 years. They work diligently and quietly to document Syria's atrocities, and it's not easy or pleasant work. In January, they have issued their 10th annual report, and I would encourage you to find it on their website. In it, they detail several patterns of the most notable human rights violations in Syria, as well as key events in the political, judicial, and military spheres, in order to give a clearer picture of the context that the violations are taking place in. And it stresses the direct responsibility of the Syrian regime in committing those violations, including the names of some officials that they believe are involved in committing them. It also provides a record of the most notable human rights violations committed by all the other parties to the conflict as well. And as the 10th anniversary of the start of the uprising approaches, it's more important than ever that we all think about what we can do to end the conflict, to end these atrocious crimes, and to achieve a just solution for the victims, and to make real progress towards transitional justice. So I'm honored today to have an all-star protection and atrocity prevention panel with me. And over the next hour, we're going to try to understand better why more hasn't been done and what we could do from here. So very quickly, just to introduce the panelists, we have Fadel Abdul Ghany from the Syrian Network for Human Rights. We have Kristyan Benedict from the Amnesty International, Dr. Simon Adams from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, Patrick Kroker from SNHR, and Anna Fleischer from Heinrich Boell. So I thought, Fadel, could we start with you? Are you able to give us a brief outline of the latest report's headlines to start us off?
Thank you very much, Emma. And many thanks to my dear colleagues for their participation and supporting our work, the result of the most notable violation of human rights in Syria in 2020. We have titled the report as a bloody decade because it's the 10th year since the start of the popular movement in March 2011, calling for freedom, dignity, and a political transition to democracy. 10 years have passed, all bloody, and all kinds or several kinds of horrific violation have been committed, and some amount to be crimes against humanity. A quick presentation of the outcome of the report in 2020 and comparing with the previous year, we find out that in 2020, we documented 1,734 civilians being killed, including 326 children and 100 and 168 women, adult female. The arbitrary arrest is still taking place. The most of those cases amount to be enforced disappearance. We documented 1,882 cases, including 52 children and 39 women. At least 157 individuals died due to torture in 2020. Some of them maybe died before. We don't know exactly which is the date, but that's what we are able to document in 2020. The total of medical persons killed was 13, while 5 medical workers were killed. At least 326 attacks on the civilians' vital facility. The Syrian regime used cluster munition in 4 attacks in 2020, while at least 374 Boell bombs dropped by the Syrian regime air forces in the same year, in 2020. Civilians' casualties continue to occur as a result of explosion remnants of the previous bombardment and exploded of mines, cluster munition, mainly taking place in Deir ez-Zor, Hama, Idlib, and the children was the main casualties in those attacks. Around 850,000 people were forcibly displaced. 90% of those displacements taking place at the first 2 months of 2020. The displaced children in particular suffered from the lack of health, education, and women suffered significantly from the almost all types of violation, in addition of the fact that many women became the main source of income for their family as well. We documented blackmail of women due to the hunger and poverty, mainly in the northwest of Syria. Despite that, the amount of these violations is the less than previous years, but still the highest number in the world. The numbers are frightening, and we confirm that there are many incidents we are unable to document. But still, some violations have increased in comparison with the previous years. I'll give 2 examples, then I'll finish. COVID-19 pandemic have generated a well-founded fears for the fate of the detainees. We still have approximately 184,000 Syrian citizens that are still arrested for a political reason, including 132,000 detainees or forcibly disappeared at the hand of the Syrian regime. So we didn't document that the Syrian regime released any detainees due to COVID-19. On contrary, we noticed that the detention is still taking place, and we documented several times with other human rights organizations the circumstances of the center detention and the lack of the medical care, and that's the main reason of the people who died due to torture. So less than 70 square centimeters is what is the person can get. The second violation, which is also increased in comparison with the previous year, is the seizing and the looting of the properties. We noticed that this became a strategy for the Syrian regime. Here we refer to special, we cannot say it's a law, but the regime named those conscription as a law, and based on those they legitimate his crimes by seizing the properties and the lands for the displacement. Mainly it's targeting the refugees and the displaced Syrian, they are approximately 13 millions for their, based on their political background. So I'll stop here and I'll give you the floor back in.
Thanks, Fadel. And just quickly to the audience, if you have questions, we can pop them into the Q&A and we'll try and get to them once we've been through all of our speakers. So Simon, I wanted to turn to you first off. In prior contexts where we've had sort of ongoing mass atrocities in Rwanda or Sri Lanka or Myanmar, the lack of reliable information about those sort of human rights violations has been cited as part of the reason for the failure to protect. As we've heard from Fadel, his organization have been documenting what's been happening in Syria very diligently for the last 10 years. So I was wondering if you could explain to us a little bit about why that hasn't translated into any kind of end to this so far.
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and thanks to Fadel and of course to the Syrian Network for Human Rights for hosting this event. And you know, I think to start at the, with the obvious point, although Syria has kind of disappeared from the international headlines, I think the violations and abuses that have been endured by the Syrian people because of these atrocity crimes is far from over. And to answer your question, Emma, the problem has never been a lack of information. If anything, there's been an avalanche of information, including by people like the Syrian Network for Human Rights. And I really commend Fadel and his team for that latest report. And you know, if you want to see the granularity of the information, go to that report and look at where it talks about individuals and who the perpetrator was. And I think, you know, all through this, we've seen that ordinary civilians in Syria have paid with their lives because of the failure of the international community to uphold international law and to uphold universal human rights in Syria. And, you know, we're on the 10-year mark of that conflict, which is an amazing thing to contemplate. And what's the numbers now? You know, 580,000, we think, killed, 13 million people displaced. Or if you look at even, you know, you go down to the next level and you look at specific parts of the conflict, you know, of course, the offensive in Idlib by the Syrian regime and by its Russian allies, where we saw, 1,500 civilians killed, 1 million people displaced in a campaign of organized cruelty, which really focused on the points of vulnerability for civilians, you know, bombing hospitals, targeting schools, destroying evacuation routes and making it harder for people to flee from harm. And I think the answer to your question is none of this has been because of a lack of information. It has been because over the last 10 years, the UN Security Council, the only international body deemed responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, has consistently failed to uphold its responsibility to protect the Syrian people. We've had those 16 vetoes by Russia, 8 of which were alongside China, which have undermined international efforts to hold perpetrators of the conflict accountable and to see the situation referred to the International Criminal Court. So I think, you know, that is the reason for this deadly cycle of impunity that we've seen with the horrors. And if I could just maybe end by making one very quick point, which is in the information overload and in this situation of kind of impunity begetting impunity, it hasn't been a completely hopeless story in the sense that if there is a glimmer of hope in all of this, it is this, which is that despite the utter failure of the UN Security Council, we have seen other UN bodies, we have seen individual states be kind of bold and innovative in trying to address the crisis using information by organizations like the Syrian Network for Human Rights and the Commission of Inquiry to pursue accountability, you know, whether that be through the Board of Inquiry that was set up to look into the bombing of hospitals in particular in Idlib, whether that be through the establishment of the IIIM via the UN General Assembly, whether that be now with cases happening under universal jurisdiction in Germany and in other places. And finally, in September last year, the government of the Netherlands, of course, indicating that it's prepared and going to try and take the Syrian regime to the International Court of Justice for violating torture conventions. And I think all of these should be supported and should be, rigorously pursued, because I think 10 years in, there must be no normalization of the Syrian regime, and there should be no forgiving and no forgetting of a government that has essentially waged a war against its own people for an entire decade.
Thanks, Simon. Patrick, I wanted to go to you to see if you were able to flesh out for us a little bit more about some of those tools for accountability that we just heard about from Simon.
Yeah, sure. Also from my side, thank you very much for organizing this event, to Fadel and the team from the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and for giving me the possibility to participate. Yeah, indeed. I mean, when the Syrian conflict started, we already had a body of international criminal law that was pretty developed. And I think that's one of the reasons why there was a lot of hope in the beginning of all these great individuals and organizations, such as the Syrian Network for Human Rights, who documented all these crimes. There was very high hopes towards these international justice mechanisms. And that's the reason why Simon, I think, rightly called it an avalanche of information. And that also means it's an avalanche of documentation that can also potentially be turned into evidence for these crimes. And international criminal law is kind of, trying to back up or to protect international human rights law by sanctioning the individuals that breach it. And so, of course, there was a lot of hope on that side, and a lot of documentation. And really, one cannot really stress, enough the importance and the great work of all these organizations that has been done, that have so diligently and courageously documented everything that has happened. But then, however, there was this big disappointment, because the avenues for justice, they were all closed. I mean, mainly because of the veto, that the avenue towards the International Criminal Court, because the Security Council, couldn't refer, or didn't want to refer, so to say, because of the vetoes by Russia and China. And this has, then led to some years, I would say, between when it became clear that there would be no International Criminal Court involved, in 2015 towards 2017, 2018, when there was a lot of, organizations and state entities and civil society organizations, also such as the Syrian Network for Human Rights, also including, us with the SNHR, to come up with new ways to achieve that. And I also think that to some degree we can today, think of some steps that have been taken and that were really, I would say, quite, surprising in the end. I mean, we always demanded these steps, but that they would actually happen. I'm mainly speaking, of course, of the arrest warrants that were handed down in 2018 against Jamil Hassan, head of the Syrian Air Force Intelligence, in France and in Germany, and then also in France against Ali Mamlouk and Abdul Salam Mahmoud. This was really, I think, a key moment also when it comes to the history of international criminal law, so to say, that the principle of universal jurisdiction is producing these results is certainly a sign for hope, but definitely only a sign to keep on doing this work, because these are 3 individuals and these are arrest warrants. And we all know very well that these persons probably don't fear very much right now. Hopefully, though, they do feel a bit uneasy at the prospect that these are international arrest warrants. And whenever they go anywhere outside of Syria, they should have this at least in the back of their minds. Now, there are also cases ongoing that also, I think, what is a good sign, have been started with the involvement of many survivors of torture, families of deceased, etc. in Sweden, in Austria, in Norway. The IIIM, as Simon has mentioned, has been created, which is also really great, that the UN General Assembly really took action, kind of, going around the Security Council. And then what has also been mentioned with the case before the International Court of Justice, which is, of course, a very state-centered entity. So I think we must, put it into perspective. Hopefully there will be also many survivors' voices heard, and it doesn't become a too kind of technical question, between 2 states. But nevertheless, these are really good signs. And then there is this case ongoing in Koblenz that has been mentioned on the Al-Khatib branch. And here we do have with Anwar R, in the docs. I mean, these are 58 cases of murder and 4,000 cases of torture as a crime against humanity that we have already presented before the court. And just in December, there was an arrest warrant that was kind of renewed against a former doctor, also, allegedly, torture and killings in Syrian military hospitals, etc. So adding more to that, and we will see more of that. And so I think there was, all this documentation that had taken place also, and especially by the Syrian civil society actors, we kind of could put it to use in some way. But nevertheless, I mean, the gaps that are still huge, right? And there's so much more that needs to be done, and that we need to demand from ourselves, from the international community, and from our government, so to say. This concerns, on the one hand, specific topics that so far have been not gotten the attention, in investigations that they should. I'm mainly speaking about conflict-related sexualized violence, which is something that is still neglected in some way, but especially also more people that need to be investigated, so that we close the accountability gap maybe a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Kristyan, I wanted to turn to you and ask how we all can boost the presence of the Syrian crisis on the international agenda and boost these efforts that are underway toward attaining a just solution to the conflict. And also look at if there are any other tools available for pressure.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, big question, lots of answers. Just to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you as well, Fadel, and your team as well for another incredibly comprehensive report. I mean, it's always sad reading these reports, as Emma intimated, but they are valuable, and keep up that important work. It is vital, and that information is used, as you know, by NGOs, by states, and by other parties. I think, with your question, I think focusing down on what is at the root of this crisis, the impunity which is at the root of this crisis, the stubbornness and the recalcitrance of the main actors, in particular the Syrian regime, the Russians, and numerous other actors and parties to the conflict. So addressing that impunity gap, as Simon and Patrick have also touched on as well. What does that look like? I mean, I'm not going to be able to satisfy everybody by just talking about justice and accountability, because there's obviously lots of different tools, lots of different methods and means that could be taken, that have been proposed. Clearly, what's been tried so far hasn't been effective. What hasn't really been tried, though, by the international community, from states right through to Syrian diaspora groups and everybody in between, is a massive, massive investment in local, regional, and international justice and accountability efforts, whether those are Syrian-led victims groups, groups working on strategic litigation, whether it's the IIIM that has been mentioned. We have seen, and quite rightly, a huge amount of money put into the humanitarian crisis, and that's important. We've seen a huge amount of money put into various military efforts by external actors. We've seen a lot of money put into justice and accountability efforts, but it's a fraction of what has been put into the humanitarian and the military side of things, or the diplomatic track as well. I work a lot with Syrian victims groups and groups working on investigations and strategic litigations, helping them develop their plans and their fundraising and financial management systems, just to make them more effective, to do the sort of work that they're doing in places like Koblenz. I see how much money they're bringing in. It's terrible. The amount of money that is coming in is terrible, and I think a lot more effort could be put into Syrian victims groups and legal organizations, whether it's from states, whether it's from other fundraising sources or whether it's from the Syrian diaspora community. The money is out there. It's just not really being channeled. So, you know, I would like to see a lot more platforming and awareness of groups like the Syrian Centre for Media, Anwar Bunny's organization, groups that Patrick's been working with really well in Koblenz, but also some of the victims organizations as well. TAFI, the SNHR Association, Families for Freedom. These groups have identified how it is impunity that drives the crisis. They've got a very crystal clear focus on what needs to change inside the country. And you know, it's Syria, so you're always going to come across what ifs, or but what about this, or roadblocks, or some smart analyst who has a different interpretation of how to remedy the situation. But ultimately, the root of this crisis, and not just the 10 years, but for decades, is that impunity issue. And in a sense, it's something that can be done outside of the geopolitics. You know, it's a purer form of pressure, if you like. So I would emphasize that. I mean, there are other tools, of course. There's been lots of debate recently around the use of sanctions, targeted sanctions or whatever. And I think targeted sanctions have a place. They are a tool. I think they need to be sharpened up, but they have a place. And you know, the regime at the moment has a fairly sophisticated propaganda campaign in the West to remove these sanctions and to locate Western sanctions as the main reason there was a crisis in Syria. That's basically the top line. Obviously, there's something deeper underneath that around not just removing the sanctions, but also demanding stabilization and reconstruction funds. But that's another issue for later. So I think a lot of effort also needs to be made to communicate with Syrians inside regime-held territory about why the situation is like this, deconstructing the Syrian regime's narrative and making it clear what the regime needs to do and what it isn't doing. I mean, it's been clear since March 2011. Resolution 2254 is very clear. But how many people are reading a Security Council resolution? Not that much. So a lot more focused on more targeted strategic communications to people in regime-held areas about what the regime itself needs to do to, address this massive crisis inside Syria. But that's very top line. I'll leave it at that, and maybe we'll come back to some of those things later.
Thank you, Kristyan. Anna, I wanted to ask you a bit more about something Kristyan touched on, which was the role or roles that sort of both international but also local organizations have played in the context. And I wondered if you could also talk a little bit about women's groups in particular and how they have moved forward with the accountability agenda.
Thank you, Emma. Also, I would like to thank the team of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. I mean, I can't count the times that I've looked up information that they have provided and assembled. Yes, I would like to touch on a few things that were said by the other speakers as well. I think that, both local and international organizations in the situation that we're in now have a responsibility to understand the layers of violations that we're looking at, because we're looking at more than bombings, kidnapping, enforced disappearance, and detention. And those are all very important to document and to understand and to call out. However, we're also looking at more complex and difficult to understand violations. For example, the statelessness of children born in areas outside of regime control, or children born to women of foreign fighters. That issue will definitely define the future of the country as well, and will make it very, very difficult. We're also looking at a situation in Lebanon where lots of children have been born in the past few years who do not possess the proper documentation. Therefore, it will be extremely hard to prove that they are in fact Syrian children. So I think what we have to understand, and that's why I kind of also wanted to touch on the work of women's groups, is that there's multiple layers of violations that sometimes are very hard to understand and to dissect. First of all, because of the lack of information. Second of all, because of the sensibility and sensitivities around these issues. There has been a push among Syrian feminist and women's organizations to, for example, talk about the trauma of detention for women and what it means for women after their release, that they're actually, you know, ostracized and pushed out of Syrian society and out of their communities because they are seen as, you know, shameful because of their detention and the experiences that are assumed that they lived through. So we're looking at different levels and layers of violations that are extremely important to understand. From the standpoint of an international organization such as ours, I think we have a responsibility to help facilitate dialogue and create conversations between people. So, for example, creating opportunities in Arabic to speak about certain issues. So, for example, at the end of last year, we were able to have Patrick and others in an event series that was done exclusively in Arabic for a Syrian audience to understand universal jurisdiction, to discuss, you know, the different avenues to justice, to understand what is happening in Koblenz, because there's still a lot of lack of information in Arabic about a lot of these processes that are going on right now in Europe concerning Syria. And here we come to the second responsibility that we have as international organizations. We need to be aware of the developments in our own countries. At the beginning of this year, the German Interior Ministry decided to stop the general ban of deportations for Syrians and is now looking into deporting criminals, as they say it themselves. It's not really clear yet what that means and what this label actually will encompass, but this is an extremely worrying sign because it means that the domestic policies and the domestic political pressures are actually working against the reality that we all just described, and it's making it extremely difficult to keep up the narrative. And I think here we all have to work together. We have to work between local and international organizations to make sure that the narrative of the last 10 years of civilians and of peaceful protests and of families of the missing and families of the disappeared stays alive, because we're at a point now where the conflict has been going on for such a long time that there is a certain Syria fatigue that was touched on by some of the panelists. And it's very important that we keep the issue up. And it's even more important that we make sure that Syrians are heard, and we're a bit guilty of it tonight as well. There should have definitely been more Syrians with us, but it's more important for us to always make sure that we include Syrian voices in what we are doing and to recognize the expertise that is out there. You know, people like Fadel and his team and other incredible Syrian organizations, and that we facilitate this dialogue, because it's not just about sort of where we have come to, but it's also where we want to go. And we still have an uphill battle, and it's still a lot of work that needs to be done between the Syrian diaspora community and, for example, European communities. And there's also realities on the ground for Syrian refugees in other places, such as Lebanon, where the situation is becoming more and more dire. So I think we have those responsibilities to really make sure that we sort of stay on top of the domestic policies that are being passed, and we need to always connect it back to the situation in Syria. We cannot just look at it as a domestic issue, to really make sure, secondly, that we have a victim or survivor-centered approach. Thirdly, to listen to women's voices and women's rights groups, because they oftentimes indicate problems that are medium to long-term in their nature, because they are connected to family and to sort of the concerns also that are in the private and how that translates into the public. And lastly, just to make sure that we keep talking about the narrative. And here, for example, we at Heinrich Boell Foundation work with artists, with creatives, with filmmakers, to make sure that we support people who want to tell their story and who want to make sure that their story is you know, put out there in a way that they feel is engaging, but also to really make sure that they have an opportunity to have their voices heard. So I think those are the responsibilities that we have all together. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. And I would encourage our audience to get your questions in now while we turn to Fadel, so we can come back to those in just a minute. Fadel, I wanted to ask you what you think the potential impact of all of these violations is on the Syrian state and on society, and how it relates to the current political process, sort of in particular the Constitutional Committee, which is happening at the moment.
The impact actually unmeasurable. We cannot even imagine what is the impact. As Anna said, how about the impact on the children, the future of those children, recruitment of the children, which is still taking place. The scale of the violation is unimaginable. So I think that, and regarding the what we can do to eliminate at least those violations, I think that we need an urgent action. Not only my colleague is talked about the prosecution and which this path is key in the Syria context. But regarding the total failure of eliminate, I'm giving you an example that all the international community, including the Astana process, Geneva process, unable to release one single detainees. For example, Abdulaziz al-Khayyar. This Abdulaziz al-Khayyar is a Russian unable to even reveal his fate. So we are talking about actually in-depth failure, continuous violations, and there is now speaking about presidential election. So that means rehabilitate for the most alleged criminal. So that means the work of the international organization, the local organization together, including the individuals, and the responsibility for the civilized democratic state is a key message in this regard. What has happened in Syria is not only the responsibility for the Iranian and the regime, the Russian, but how about the responsibility for the civilized state, which we are hanging our hope on them to prevent and to stop the violation by protect the civilians while the Security Council is under total failure. So what to do? There is here contradiction between the failure of the Security Council and the continuity of the crimes against humanity. Hereby the intervention is more I think it's something have been or should be done to eliminate those crimes. For example, sanction. Kristyan highlight the sanction. Sanction exists due to those violations. The UN didn't implement any sanction against the regime. This is failure. Even military sanction or economic sanction. There is no sanction from the UN. Sanctions from state for what the regime did. So I don't see any hope, unfortunately, to be honest. And this process, which is taking place, is still pre-negotiation. There's not like, and what they are talking about, constitution, who is like demolish and the constitution or even the international law. So unfortunately, while the willing of the democratic civilized country like this, there is no hope to stop those violations. I'm telling you that in January 2021, we recorded similar violation, extrajudicial killing, and we have monthly report, as you know, so 113 civilians killed, 214 detention taking place in 2021. So nothing being changed, and nothing will be changed unless there is a decisive willing to take what's going on in the consideration in Syria. Fighting crimes against humanity, it's not only our responsibility as a Syrian. And many thanks to our friend, like here the distinguished colleagues and others as well. But I think we need to think more how we can maybe bring or redraw the attention about the crimes against humanity taking place in Syria again. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Fadel. I think that's a lot for us all to think about, and certainly for folks on the call, as well as those of us on the panel, to take away with us and be making sure that we're doing more. I wanted to jump in with a couple of questions here from the audience that are quite specific. So Patrick, maybe if you could answer the question, will the ICC ever act in Syria? Give us a little brief update on where we're at with the ICC, if at all. And then if we could jump straight to Simon after that. There was a question, Canada and Brazil are two states which pushed forth the adoption of the responsibility to protect. I'm assuming you're our resident expert on that. And what's been the commitment towards the situation in Syria with regard to RTP and pushing forward for a peace deal? So if we jump to you two, and then I'll come back for some more questions.
All right, should I give it a go? Okay. Yeah, will the ICC ever act in the case of Syria? I guess the answer will be inshallah. I really hope so, that it will. It's the institution that was built because of these situations and precisely for these situations. However, I mean, it's an international court, it's an international instrument, and it represents really a big compromise of all the states that were present, and the most powerful states in the world, or some of them at least, including the US, China, etc. They are not part of that of the statute. And so that makes it complicated also for the court to act. There are some possibilities in which it could happen that the ICC gets active. Theoretically, it's possible that the Security Council refers the situation in Syria to the ICC. So of course, this like now seems politically to be completely out of the question, but it could happen. Another option would be that a future Syrian government that looks different than the one today actually accedes to the Rome Statute and accepts the jurisdiction of the court also for crimes that happened in the past. So this is also an option, and of course the one that we would, I guess, all like to see, which would bring most hope, because I still think we have been speaking now about the extraterritorial ways of jurisdiction to try these crimes. Where this should happen one day is in Syria. I mean, these are crimes that have been committed, by Syrians mainly against, of course, sometimes with the help also of others, including, Western corporations, etc. But mainly Syrians against Syrians in Syria. So that's the place where these trials also should take place one day, hopefully, and then maybe also with the support of an international criminal court. But it would need, again, a future government to accede to the Rome Statute. And then there are attempts, of course, also to try and trigger the jurisdiction of the ICC already now. It has been discussed in the case of Myanmar, where people were driven, basically by force across the border to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is a party to the Rome Statute, that this could kind of, trigger the jurisdiction of the court. A similar argument has been made because of people being pushed out of Syria over the border to Jordan, and Jordan is a member of the ICC, and there can of course be constellations, But I must say that my personal kind of legal opinion on that is that I don't find it likely that the ICC will follow the argumentation. And I hope that there will be a future government one day that will accede to the ICC. But of course, this is in the very long future only.
You want me to jump in with the answer that question that you mentioned? Look, with regard to the responsibility to protect, which is of course this norm, this idea that developed in 2005, really in response to genocide in Rwanda and in Srebrenica during the 1990s, and it has had kind of widespread acceptance as an idea. But like all great ideas, including this little thing called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's much harder to put into practice in the real world than it is to compose in a chamber somewhere. So, I mean, what is the responsibility to protect situation with regard to Syria? You know, I would go back to what I sort of said in my introductory comments, which is that, you know, from the starting point that it's been an absolute failure with regard to Syria, that so many Syrian people have died, the country has been destroyed, people have not upheld their responsibility to protect, or the UN Security Council in particular. But then when you look at it in a little bit more detail, we have had quite a number of countries, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's something like 37 countries have imposed bilateral targeted sanctions on senior officials within the Syrian regime, those who are responsible for torture, those who are responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. We have seen overwhelming support in the UN General Assembly and in the Human Rights Council and so forth for accountability measures, whether that be establishing a commission of inquiry, the IIIM and the GA, or just condemning the actions of the Syrian regime. We've seen the legal initiatives that Patrick and other people have spoken about. Anna's spoken about it as well here today. And I think also at a basic human level, you know, we've seen states and ordinary people look at the refugee crisis, millions and millions of people who have been looked after in Turkey, in Jordan, in Germany, in Switzerland. You know, I traveled around parts of Europe in 2015 at the height of the crisis. And on the one hand, it was devastating to see people, you know, walking across the European mainland trying to find sanctuary. On the other hand, and I think that I'm not alone in this, you know, everywhere I was, in every train station or anywhere I was, you saw ordinary people also, you know, buying bottles of water and handing them out to desperate people, and other basic human acts of solidarity and empathy in terms of people who are fleeing from the crisis. You know, I think we have to put the full weight of this failure very firmly in front of the UN Security Council, who have failed so fundamentally to uphold their legal obligations and their more broad obligation to stop atrocities in Syria and to hold the perpetrators accountable. But I think there is, and I would just like to return, maybe, and the last thing I'd say is to that human element, because, you know, like many people who are on this call, you know, I've been working on the situation in Syria now for 10 years, which is kind of inconceivable to me on one level. And in that time, I couldn't tell you how many speeches I've given around the world in different places and on the issue of Syria, whether that be in community groups, universities, you know, whatever, to governments and so on and so forth. I have never had a single person come up to me and say, what happens in Syria is nothing to do with me, is not my business, and what goes on behind the borders of the Syrian regime. Why should I care about what happens to people in Homs or Hama or Aleppo or somewhere else? In fact, I've seen nothing but the reverse. Tremendous concern, and everyone's spoken about, you know, Syria fatigue, but I've seen consistently over 10 years the absolute opposite, which is a human awareness of people on all the continents of the world looking at this and seeing ordinary people being gunned down in the streets on, you know, for protesting for democracy, or being bombed, you know, subjected to kneel or starve tactics, subjected to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and wondering why the international community isn't doing more to stop it. And I think that is the one thing out of this entire mess that gives me a little bit of hope.
Thanks, Simon. Kristyan, I wanted to turn to you. We've got a couple of questions. One's about Turkey and one's about Russia. And both are basically along the lines of how are we making sure that all of those states that are involved in some kinds of human rights abuses are also part of these accountability efforts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think moving away from the sort of pure issue of justice and accountability I was talking about earlier and into the murky, dirty world of geopolitics, you know, there needs to be a recognition, obviously, that Turkey and Russia have interests in Syria and have had them for a long time. So how are those factored into any initiative? One caveat, you know, because hopefully we'll come back to it at some point, and Anna touched on it as well, around ensuring that Syrian human rights defenders, Syrian feminists and wider are part of all these initiatives. That's crucial. But just coming back to, yeah, Turkey and Russia, you know, having an understanding and an appreciation of what is in their interest. Go back to that issue of what I was talking about a regime that just does not compromise. And the logistics of how do you communicate with a regime like that? You know, I remember a conversation I had with a Syrian official right at the start of the crisis, at when the Syrian embassy was open in the UK. We were talking about whether they could reach out to some of the Nordic countries around crowd control measures and the use of force. This is very, very early on. And, you know, the official was saying, well, I agree with you, I do, but there's no way I can send this message back to Damascus because they'll think I've turned and my family will be disappeared. So I agree with you, yes, totally, but we can't communicate that. So there's a difficulty with who the interlocutors are. Russia is obviously best placed to be communicating with senior figures in the regime, but, you know, they're not messenger boys. They have their interests and they want their interests maintained, whether it's military or business. And that's, you know, a difficult concept to hear from people who are fighting against war crimes and crimes against humanity, especially Syrians who have been on the receiving end of Russia's brute force. But that's a reality. It's a geopolitical reality that needs to be factored in. And I do wonder with the new administration in the US if there is an increased effort for an international diplomatic push, that some of these factors will be built in. We've heard of people in the administration or coming into the administration, or even the UN Syria envoy talking about the need to be more explicit about what confidence building measures are needed along these tracks. So it's possible that the different national interests or security interests or business interests that Turkey and Russia have are factored into that. I don't like that, but it's just a reality that needs to be factored in. And I dare say that would apply to Iran as well, and it would apply to lots of non-state actors who we all have to hold our nose to if we were looking to engage and have that conversation. But, you know, it's a long shot. Fadel, I think, mentioned the Constitutional Committee as a sort of early version of that. And, you know, we're seeing how the regime is absolutely stringing the UN along and is playing delaying tactics, and it's just pushing back every sort of well-meaning initiative, either that the Syrian opposition or the civil society bodies have, or Peterson himself has. And it looks like it's going nowhere at the moment. So, you know, what pressure can then be put on Russia? It's a two-way thing, isn't it? Carrot and sticks. What pressure can be put on Russia to get them to communicate to senior figures in the regime that, you know, eventually this is going to impact on our interests, and we can't allow that. But that's a long way away, I think, and a lot of it will depend on the will of the new US administration and the EU as well. And, you know, it's our job to ensure, as Anna was saying, that Syria becomes a priority again. It has slipped down. I think that is true. It has slipped down, and I think a lot of states, and definitely under the Trump administration, we've started to see a containment model happening, and that containment model might persist because it's easier, you know, and the EU subcontracting Turkey as a border guard, if you like. There's a possibility that might happen, and that's something to be pushed against.
Thanks. And I wanted to come to you. We've only got 5 minutes left, so I want to come to you and then finish, of course, with Fadel. We've got a question, and it says, our Holocaust is the deprivation of any promise or hope that the worst is already behind us. And I think that this is probably one of the first events in what's going to be a busy couple of months around the 10-year anniversary of the beginning of the uprising, which is going to be a monumental sort of marker point, and a very appropriate time to ask ourselves those hard questions about, you know, how did we get here, and what's going to change to make sure we're not here in another 10. But I wanted to ask you sort of what you think of that statement, and also with the work that you're doing. What hope do you see? Where are those sort of the building blocks of hope that you see in the work that you're doing, the people that you were talking to, that you think could really be empowered over the next year or 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think as most of this panel, and definitely for any Syrian activist, I think this is a very crucial time. And you know, my friends and colleagues and former colleagues are extremely emotional in this time, because it just feels like so much has been lost, and it doesn't just feel, a lot has been lost. There's been a lot of despair and death and uncertainty and displacement and trauma. And I think that this is actually a crucial time for us to talk about the narrative. As I said earlier, it's important to, you know, rewatch films, to look again at books that have been written. And I mean, the statement of hopelessness, I think anyone who works on Syria or with Syrians, or for any Syrian who's lived through it, it has felt for the past few years like we're always going from bad to worse. There has never been a time in the last 6 years that at least I've been working on the issue where I felt like we have won anything. And that is extremely difficult and extremely taxing emotionally, psychologically for everyone who works on it. And I think that we're in a situation where it's very important to look at the in-between spaces, because it has been highlighted by this panel, what are the roadblocks? It's been highlighted why certain avenues to justice remain blocked. So we need to start to look at, I think, the gray areas and the in-betweens, and where we can sort of create opportunities. And I think it's very much also about something that Kristyan touched upon. You know, what about dialogue between Syrians, intra-Syrian dialogue between people who are living in different areas, people who have fled, even within the refugee community? How to make sure that people are actually exchanging information, supporting each other, helping each other. I think the work of victims groups and survivor groups is so important. And they are now working together. All different types of groups, like Kristyan has mentioned, are, you know, have joined forces, and they will launch a charter together. And I think that's an inspiring example of working together and trying to, be very clear and very strong about demands. Another thing that gives me hope, and that I always am always in awe of over the last few years working with Syrian women, is their sheer willingness to go on, even in displacement, even in trauma, even with, you know, everything that has happened to them and continues to happen to them. They just keep going on. And I've spoken to women who literally were walking to work under chemical attack, and they said, but we cannot sit at home, because sitting at home is worse than taking on the possibility of dying on the way of going to the community center and talking to the people there, taking care of the children, taking care of other women, and sitting with them. And I think that's something that we don't get to see enough of. That's something that we don't understand enough. What is the positivity and the positive things that Syrians are doing on a daily basis, despite all of the atrocities, because there is a lot to look at. Unfortunately, it doesn't make very interesting news, positive examples, but I think it's something that we really need to look into and to trust also that Syrians are doing this on a daily basis. And lastly, what gives me hope is that, for example, now in Germany, there's the first person running in an election that has fled from Syria. Tariq al-Owais, he's going to run in the elections for the German parliament. And I think that's something that's very, very exciting and very, very interesting to look at. How are Syrians developing their agendas and how are they developing their roles in displacement in their new homes? And that is something that I think is also important for us to recognize and understand and say that, now we have people who have learned the language and who want to engage and who want to be active members of society. And I think that's something that's also very worth encouraging. So I really think it's about looking at the in-betweens and having that sort of patience to look at the gray areas and not just look at the big players and the most horrible and violent violations, but to really try to find those stories that lay within and in between.
Thanks, Anna. And Fadel, I want to give you the last word about what you need from us, from those on the panel, those listening in, and those who will be, renewing their focus on Syria over the next sort of few weeks to help to make sure that we don't have, as you put it, another bleeding decade.
I will end up by a question. Why less than 1% of refugees returned? And why IDPs haven't returned to areas under the regime control? And why do they rather stay in tenants in this unimaginable cold? Why? It's a few kilometers to return to their houses and land, because they know very well that the Syrian regime is the ultimate threat and the main obstacles. So there will be no stability as long as the security forces rule Syria with the same 2011 mentality, and as well as the ultimate Russian support in the Security Council, at the UN Security Council continue. So there will be no hope for the Syria and the Syrian people to feel relief or to achieve that transitional body or transitional movement toward democracy. Fighting all of the violation and this circumstances and obstacles is our responsibility as a Syrian human rights organization, human rights defender, but with your deep cooperation and coordination. I hope that we can reveal what's going on in Syria again and regain the attention and keep pressure the politician to hopefully doing a goodwill toward end up this bloody conflict. Thank you.
Thanks, Fadel. I think those are really, really important questions to be asking. And thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you for your work. Thank you for taking part today. I thank you to our audience for coming along. Do make sure you read the Syrian Network's latest report and all of their reports. We're going to have to wrap up there, I'm afraid. But thank you so much, everybody.